Do you have a thing for huge mohawks, B-list horror movies, and glam rock? Well, you're in luck because I have a genre for you. Hello, I'm Miko, and welcome to my channel where I talk about gothy things and just things I like. And today we are talking about death rock because it is what I have been knee-deep into for the past 2 weeks while I have been doing research for other things. Death rock came out of the LA punk scene in the early 80s, differentiating itself through its greater emphasis on horror and the macabre, independent of the goth movement of the UK, which was branching off of their own punk scene and were, likewise, completely oblivious to their existence. Compared to the UK, the LA punk scene was known for being more in-your-face and political as a general rule, with bands like X, Dead Kennedys, and The Germs. Death rock follows this lead with bands like Castration Squad, 45 Grave, and Christian Death. While the early death rock scene was obviously aware of bands like Joy Division, Susie, and the Banshees, and Killing Joke, they saw these bands as more of a punk rock kind of thing. In contrast, the UK was beginning to move off punk rock cliches and saw these bands as innovators of something new, becoming the proto-goths or post-punks of their time. The West Coast punk style, alongside a love of campy horror and DIY culture, also brought forth the death rock look, which is characterized by all black leather and PVC clothes, the signature death hawk, and big stompy boots for all of your butt-kicking needs. The death rock style was a direct reflection of the music, and it was pretty intense. While the UK's goth rock can get away with being slower, more melodic, and often danceable, goth rock can be defined by huge distortion on guitars, vocals more similar to punk than typical goth rock, drums, and atmospheric bass which are not as heavy or defined as post-punk or goth rock. The main difference is that death rock is often fast-paced and unafraid to use unconventional sounds. Despite the differences, death rockers were not generally viewed as their own distinct genre. Instead, they were seen more as a darker punk or sometimes even mistaken for horror punk. The original death rock movement lasted very briefly, as the LA contingent quickly disintegrated under the weight of substance abuse and key artists in the scene moving away from the sound. For example, Christian Death moved on from its original death rock sound in their album Catastrophe Ballet, which took more of a UK-styled gothic rock flavor. At the same time, bands like Sisters of Mercy were beginning to blow up, creating a further shift towards gothic rock. In the mid-1980s, it became used as a broad reference to punk-leaning goth rock from around the world. This may have to do with the meeting of the 80s American and British goth scenes. The embrace of these two similar styles led to bands like Sex Gain Children and Blood and Roses. Some say that Blood and Roses is one of the most caustic UK gothic death rock bands ever to be overlooked. They had strong guitar hooks and vocals that dripped with seductive morbidity. Along with their extreme dynamics ranging from slow and brooding to fast and aggressive, they are a favorite hidden gem for death rockers. In Mick Mercer's Gothic Rock book from 1994, he refers to Blood and Roses as a little different with arm's distance appeal that made you wonder if they were genuinely creepy. And I think that few phrases accurately describe the early UK scene's relationship with death rock better than that. In the late 80s to early 90s, the goth subculture had become more homogeneous across the oceans, and with it, the concept of death rock quickly faded into obscurity. Instead, 90s bands like Suspira, Midnight Configuration, and Big Electric Cat began to set the style of the gothic rock genre. Along with our goth staples like The Sisters, The Mission, and Fields of the Nephilim, of course. But these bands all lacked that key punk element. This, alongside the rise of goth clubs, which began using more EBM and future pop to appeal to a wider audience, led to the slow death of death rock. The goth club Release the Bats, which opened in 1998, was, in some ways, the lone survivor of death rock. But as we all know, goth never really dies, and that applies to death rock too. In the late 1990s, a revival of the genre began, led by groups such as Bloody Dead and Sexy, The Phantom Limbs, and Cinema Strange. The death rock revival was an attempt to do something more aligned to the early goth and death rock days and move away from future pop and EBM. Although death rock may have started on the West Coast, it was quickly taken by the East Coast with NY Decay in New York City, where death rock's revival flourished. NY Decay quickly morphed from nightclub to production company, powering Drop Dead magazine and starting Drop Dead Festival in 2003. It brought an East Coast perspective to death rock, embracing horror punk and anarcho-punk and, of course, psychobilly. This new wind in the NY scene would lead to the formation of bands like The Funeral Crashers and Bell Hollow to lead the new wave of death rock, which only continued to grow into the 2000s. While goth clubs were turning away from the older goth sounds in late 90s to early 2000s, including more EBM and future pop, and of course industrial, the death rock revival embraced these sounds. For a number of years, death rock was a music subculture where horror punk, psychobilly, post-punk, and the dark art punk bands were all welcome, and this was of course the normal in the early days of death rock as well. And of course, one cannot downplay the role that New Grave magazine had in the death rock revival. In the 2000s, most goth magazines like Propaganda were out of print, and those that survived like Industrial Nation and Permission magazine, while still very important, tended to gravitate towards EBM industrial sounds. What New Grave did was provide a space for the death rock bands to promote themselves and their sound, and of course they also featured many other obscure bands within the goth genre. Not only that, but the magazine's creator, Matt Reiser, also had his own death rock band called Fear Cult. As the internet became more available in households across the US, groups like the Phantom Limbs and Black Ice began to merge death rock with elements of no wave and synth punk. Most notably, Tragic Black began to make use of an aesthetic heavily inspired by Batcave fashion. But we also finally saw death rock embrace the broader spectrum of influences, including psychobilly, EBM, and future pop, which it had tried so hard to avoid prior. Utilizing online spaces like deathrock.com, postpunk.com, MySpace, and LiveJournal, the late 2000s to 2010 saw more death rock bands experimenting with their sound, including Christ vs. Warhol as a very notable mention here. In 2014, Killed by Death Rock Volume 1 by Sacred Bones Records compiled this wave of bands into one very neatly packaged CD, along with a second volume released in 2016. And from here, outside of the fashion aspect, began the next death, if you will, of death rock. While the old bands are still creating new music, like Christ vs. Warhol's 2024 release of We the Victims of History, and Alter de Fé, who are still performing, we are now in our waiting period for the next rise of death rock, and I will absolutely be on the lookout for new bands. But if y'all see any new people who you are loving right now, please leave it in the comments. The newest I have seen are like Akvolta, Yuka Zolo, and Secret Shame. I've been very into Secret Shame lately, and the moment I saw that they were from Asheville, and Asheville is still very much recovering from that hurricane, I made sure to buy like every CD I could. But here we are, a very brief history of death rock. I hope that you guys enjoyed. It's not a genre that generally gets very much love, even though it's like pretty fun. I like it. If you guys also liked it, maybe you could like subscribe if you're not. I would appreciate it, and have a nice day.